As a demand gen marketer, chances are you've come up empty when trying to find good benchmarks for your campaigns. It's really tough to find good paid social data to benchmark against. On today's episode of Demand Gen U, we're going to talk through our annual paid social benchmark report, everything that went into creating it, and how you can use a core pillar like this in your own content strategy when coming up with new campaigns. Demand Gen U is officially in session. Let's do it. Alrighty, so clearly there are three people's faces on the screen right now, but it's also our podcast, so we can kind of do whatever we want. And Jason, I can't believe that you're recording this right now because you had a crazy early flight this morning and we were all together in person this week for an offsite in Chicago.
Yeah, that's why I've got the hat. Like I put my data hat on for our benchmark data episode.
I like it.
But more importantly, because my hair looks like a crazy person. And I don't want to scare anybody off. But yeah, it was an early day, and we'll see how this episode goes.
This is the show you want to listen to. Don't watch. Just listen to this one.
Well, with how much publicity Jason's hair's been getting on LinkedIn lately, like you got to protect it. So yeah, I support that.
Insurance policy.
Yeah. Well, awesome. So you're probably wondering why we've got three people. And what we're going to do is we're going to talk through everything that went into creating our annual paid social benchmark report. Now, we did this last year. We just released the V2 of this. Last year, it was Jason and I and some freelance help. This year, thank God, Justin's here as well. So we're going to get so much more mileage out of this thing. So we'll talk through launching it and what we've got planned coming out of it. And I'm pretty pumped about this. This is it's been an absolute beast. And like we were talking just now, the feedback that we've gotten in the week-ish since we launched it has been really positive. So we're excited.
Yeah, like this is something I always wanted to do, like, because every once in a while when you see a vendor and they've got some interesting data and you're like, man, if I could just have access to like some of that data, it would help tell a story or I'd like learn something new. And oftentimes, and Justin will probably talk about this, but it seems like if you've got proprietary data in your platform that might be valuable to other people, it could maybe easily be a core pillar of your content strategy. Yeah, because like you're the only one that has it, So like if it's proprietary and like you can tell some stories and make some insights with it, interesting.
Well, and I think just from a content perspective, we use Gong in a lot of ways as a North Star. They were really the first B2B SaaS company that I came across that was using their own platform data to share insights. And when we were coming up with this content baby last year, we both realized that there was a gap for B2B demand gen marketers. Like this type of really content and benchmark data did not exist. So we kind of looked at it with the lens of how do we come up with something that we ourselves would use and nerd out over.
Well, and think about too, like, when you do find benchmark data, it's just all like averages, you know what I mean? And so and you don't understand the context usually. And so, so that, for us, sure, same challenge, but that's also why we released the entire data set, right? So that like, if you're trying to write a report with every nuance and every, like in that data, the report's going to be untenable. But you write it about the averages, you give it some insights, and then you just release the entire data set. And that way people can actually like, oh, I can actually go in and look at companies like me instead of just taking some average benchmark. I don't know what industries you have in there, which of your customers is in there, where you're taking the benchmark from. And so that was really the light bulb moment for us was like, let's just release the entire data set, and like, let's have people go at it on their own, and like really dig in and try and find some insights. And yeah, that's what we did.
So before we really jump into it, let's do a little history lesson and talk through how this all came about last year, because it was, I'd say, very rocky last year, slightly less rocky this year, but Justin didn't have to deal with it last year.
Yeah, last year, I don't remember where the idea came from. I rarely remember those for some reason, but yeah, I really don't. But there was an idea that somebody had, and like, we want to do this thing. But and we knew exactly why. You know, it was like super rich. We're B2B marketers, right? So like we would love to have this ourselves. But like then when you start to dig in, you're like, oh, well, you don't really understand how complicated it's going to be, because you're just like, well, we already have all this data in our platform. So like, should just be like, bippity boppity boo, export the data out of the platform, and it's ready to go. And that was the biggest assumption that was so not even close to true. The data that your platform is holding is stored in a certain way that the platform needs it. You know, it's not really meant for consumption by, you know, human beings, you know, being consumed by the platform, you know. And so and it's across tables, and like, and also as you're adding new features, right, to your product throughout the year, it adds more, you know, it adds new data sets. And if you're not thinking about like, oh, we're actually going to use this to create content later on, if you're not thinking of it that way, then man, it's a bear to pull together. And so, you know, we included our, you know, engineers, people from our engineering team. I have a ex-employee colleague of mine, Brett Cobold, I'll just put his name out there, who essentially takes the raw data and makes sense of it, you know, and he puts it into like a format that can actually be consumed, and goes back and forth, and, you know, with our engineering team, and oh, this doesn't line up, or this doesn't line up, or thank God for him. And
seriously, if anybody's listening and needs help with that, shameless plug, he is awesome at what he does.
Oh, maybe I shouldn't have said anything because he has a full-time job. Oops. He did it at nights and weekends only, which is actually true. But that said, invaluable help. And but it still took forever, especially the first time, right? Because it's like me, you, we're doing everything else, you know, we had to do from a marketing standpoint.
Team of two when we did the V1 of this as well. So we had freelance help, but yeah, it was without him, we probably wouldn't have been able to do it.
Yeah. Who wrote that one?
So it was Carmen, I think.
Was that my friend? Oh, okay.
Yeah,
okay,
yeah,
that was
yeah.
my okay. Yep.
So
Carmen
basically
Hill
what we
wrote that
did
first one,
was, basically what we did was we looked at, once the data was in a good enough state, then we just started to look into it and uncover what we thought were insights, and then structured the insights into different sections and created kind of a beast of an outline for her to work off of. And then I would say the analysis, like if you look at what went into creating it, so you've got the analysis, you've got the creation of, let's just say, the guide itself, and then you've got the dashboard. Like I would say the guide and the dashboard took maybe 30-40% combined. The analysis probably took at least 50 to 60%, if not more.
Yeah, because you're going in and you have all these filters, you know, that you can use, and you're trying to just find interesting insights. Like, what's the difference between Facebook and LinkedIn on this, and, you know, image and video and headline length. And we just like, we even like last year, we didn't do it this year, but last year we actually we ran the ad text through a college grader or something like that, and it like
yeah it's like the reading level,
reading level of your content, even, you know what I mean? And does that have an effect? I don't think we did it this year because it was like, well, it's all 8s and 9s, so like really, but you know, we're just trying to think of different ways of like, okay, we have the data, what can we add on to it, you know? And obviously one of the first things is scrub the customers' names out and replace those with firmographic data. So like, great, customer A is in this industry, this many employees, this much revenue, this location, whatever the other ones were. And so we were able to like basically give you a way, and that's where you can say like, oh, okay, hey, I'm in software, you know, let me go narrow it down to software companies. Oh, I have this many employees, you know what I mean? So you can start to look at, oh, companies of your similar size, at least in industry, what kind of performance are they getting? You know, and a couple, you know, so the insights, that was a long, you're right, that took a long time. And you really need to be a good B2B marketing analyst to like go through all that data and pull out insights. You can't just like hand it over to a junior analyst. There's just too much stuff going on, and it would take them like way too long.
So before we start talking about this year's benchmark report for this, let's talk about the dashboard last year, because if I remember correctly, Was it your idea or was it Gil's idea to create the dashboard?
See, this is again,
I think it, not because I don't want to give you credit, but I think Gil was like, well, why wouldn't you create a dashboard for it? And then
might have, yeah. Yeah, I might have not wanted to because I probably was thinking like, oh, that's going to be way too hard.
And we wanted to do, I think, I'm fairly confident in this, but by the time that by the time that we were about to launch the report, maybe a week or 2 weeks out, that's when the dashboard idea came up. And I think Gil originally said Tableau dashboard, but then we were like, well, hold on. Let's graduate onto that next year. Like, we can't do that in this time frame. So what we did was we just released it in Data Studio, which I think was a solid year one effort from us, just because it was done in a very short time frame and we hadn't seen anything like that before. But we always knew that in year two that we were gonna do it bigger and better and graduate onto a Tableau dashboard.
Yeah. And that's all Brett knew last year too, and that's all we only had Brett, and he knew Data Studio. He didn't really know. He knows Tableau, but like not as well. So this year we added Tableau.
So this year's report, we were, let's just say, under the gun to get this thing out there from Olivier and our sales team, because it was such a helpful piece of content for our reps to use last year that they kept saying, when's this year's report? And, usually when Olivier asks you for something once, it's okay, I got some time, but then he asked a second time and a third time and a fourth time. And I think that really put some pressure on us to get this thing out the door. And I think the other big thing was just from like an optics perspective, we've grown so much year over year that last year's report, I think, had $15 million in ad spend. And this year's report was 42 million. So more data, hopefully better insights, and then showing the market when we were a Series A, now Series B company, that, wow, there's a lot of ad spend being run through metadata right now. So we were kind of pumping our chest a little bit.
Yeah, and it's nice for that aspect too, right? Because it's like not only are you giving insights, but you're also able, it's a nice promotional piece. You're like, oh, look at all the spend we had run through and look at some of the performance metrics. Now, this is where it gets a little hairy, because you ask yourself, you're like, well, okay, what if a prospect's going to come and see this thing? And what if they go in and they build a query in the dashboard and it is worse than the performance that they get today? Does that, I worry about that. I worried about that way more last year than this year, because it didn't really have an effect last year, or we don't know it did. Maybe some people came to it and just like crossed us out, maybe. But what the dashboard doesn't have in it is trending. You know what I mean? It doesn't have the trending stuff, and it doesn't have like where our customers started. And so that's, I think, one thing to note is it's not a ROI calculator for metadata customers. It's like, once you are a metadata customer, this is what it looks like. And some of them start, maybe with the same performance that they had before, but then we're running massive numbers of experiments for them, and they kind of improve performance. So that was one of the things we couldn't show, or just trending over time. You know what I mean? Like, oh, how's this stuff moving throughout the year? Is like Christmas more than, you know what I mean? Like, so we can't really answer that. It's just a block of data. The block of data is 2020 and then 2021. And so that's another thing, and we'll probably talk about this later, what we want to do in the future. But, each iteration will add more things.
I think we should do some merch next year and have metadata hats like that for the release of this. That'd be a good idea. So, Justin, we're having you on the podcast, not so you can just sit here and not say anything, but as
this is my normal role, so I'm just on camera this time,
As a content repurposer extraordinaire, if you had to be just drooling about something like this to use as a pillar in your content.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, I literally remember interviewing with both you and Jason in July of last year, and I was like, you all aren't doing enough with this benchmark report. It's just one of those things where whenever you have a piece of, whether it's original research, a survey, this type of data set where you can create multiple streams of content off of it and link back to your own stuff, because so much data out there is linked back to, it's really lazy. It's linked back to an unknown source. Somebody threw a stat out in some, infographic in 2018, and now you're going to quote that stat and you really don't know where it came from. This stuff is like solid data where you can have your piece of content, and ideally have something where other people want that information as well. That's the gold standard, is if you have this data, but then other people want that too, and they're looking for it, and you can provide that. That's gold. So yeah, absolutely. It was one of the main things that got me excited even before I started working here, was like, man, there's so much here.
So maybe as a refresher, and to kind of shame Jason and I, let's talk about what we had last year, just as far as assets and like what we got out of it, because we, like you said, we didn't get nearly as much as we could have. So we had a landing page that had a link to the Data Studio dashboard in addition to the PDF. We had I believe a single blog post that was written for, I think it was B2B paid social benchmarks.
That
right?
Before I came, you guys had a blog post that was just kind of Jason, like, hey, we launched this thing. Here's what it is. We spent a lot of that type of, like, here's a summary. It was almost like a summary of the report, basically.
Right.
And
it was a PDF.
It opened up.
Yeah, that's right.
It opened up our eyes, because up until that point, like most B2B marketers out there, like I thought, isn't that what you're supposed to do? And then once you got here, you quickly opened up our eyes of, hey, here's how you can slice it up into a million different ways. So maybe you can talk us through what you saw as opportunities for us when we were doing this V2 in 2022.
Yeah. And I mean, honestly, one of the first things I did, so I started in end of August, and I think by early October, the first week of October, I had relaunched the benchmark report as a full-on blog. So it was searchable. And I think that's a key for us, but also if anybody else is doing sort of original research like this, even when we did V2, it was sort of like, are we going to do a PDF? And we actually did one like way late in the game, but that's not what we led with. We led with this page because a PDF is horrible to share. You have to like attach it or like find the like weird, embed URL or something like that. You can't tie it to analytics. There's no way to see how many people are viewing this thing. And then there's no way, I guess a search engine technically could pick up a PDF. It does from here and there, but not really. And so for all those reasons, that's why we chose to go with, and we're not going to gate it. That was the other thing too. We just, we'll just throw it out there and let it be. And so, yeah, those are probably the main 3 or 4 reasons why we ended up going with that big sort of full-on blog post with the content in it.
So, I would say we never thought about gating this ever, right, Jason?
Nope. No, just not our, yeah. But
I know that's kind of our MO, but also I think the value of it is, one, being associated with, being the company who's doing this sort of, platform analysis and sharing the insights and not asking for anything in return. But 2, just the number of eyeballs that we've gotten on it. Like, I think, Justin, we were talking earlier about how big of a splash this was in year 2, and it was the 3rd largest traffic
like
day.
That. Yeah, it was really big for us. Yeah.
And like, we've had, not to, humble brag, we've had some big days this year. So for it to be top 3, like, that's a huge deal.
Yeah, I think the other thing too that people don't, it's sort of a short-sighted versus long-term approach with some of this. Like, if you gate the content, you're by definition putting a blocker in front of somebody getting access to that. Well, that also puts a blocker up from somebody sharing it, from somebody wanting to link to it, from somebody wanting to, put a mention from an article back to it. Like, there's all of those things that you're hindering. So if there's anybody out there, or any like sort of marketing folks that want to go halfway, something you still want to have a piece to gate. What I've done in the past is actually have a PDF version, but then use that as a content upgrade, and you could gate that off the blog. So you could have everything be in there and be live and be accessible, but then it's like, hey, if you want the PDF version that you can print and download and markup and all that stuff, here's that version. Oh, by the way, give us your email address, and you know, you could play it that way too, and kind of play in both lanes.
So let's talk a little bit about how we created it. You know, once the data was cleaned up, the analysis was done. So we had you, and you know, we do get some outside help from our agency, Algert, and then we work with Brooklyn Nash as well, who's amazing for this sort of thing. So help people better understand what that process looked like, Justin.
Yeah, this is the first time that I've done, obviously, the report here at Metadata, but also like really had to kind of piece all of those things together and make sure it all worked. The biggest thing, I mean, you were talking about the analysis. That was the biggest thing, is just making sure the analysis is done and set, because even if you're hiring an outside writer, or you're hiring an internal writer, they might not be the expert in that data set. So you still have to like make sure like somebody is there to pull out the insights that you want to say, and then, you know, create the words around it and have that. So one thing I'll say, and I know we've talked about this even internally, like the amount of upfront time that it takes to like do something like this, it takes a lot of time. Like it almost needs to be like months and months and months in advance planning. Like if this is going to be a pillar, if this is going to be a cornerstone piece of content, like treat it like that. Like give it the time and effort it needs to be able to get created, because there's so much. That's the one. There's so much back and forth. You know, we were back and forth, and Jason could probably talk to this with the analyst, and we're back and forth with the Tableau developer, and we're back and forth with Brooklyn, and we're trying to back and forth with the Algor, getting the designs all set up and trying to piece all that together. So for me, like my role was, I wasn't like actually like writing it, but I was managing all of the stuff and all of the pieces around it to try to put that in and make it a nice final piece. And so that was the bulk of the work, was honestly just a lot of project management, a lot of like communication, and just understanding what the final output wanted to be.
Well, I mean, that in itself is a beast of an undertaking, because we're trying to push the data as far as we can so you can get started working on this with all the other moving pieces in play, because we couldn't just wait for the data to be perfect, or else we would still be working on this right now. So it's, how do you walk that fine line between having enough data and in a good enough state that we can start to create an outline and write copy for this and start designing it and all that stuff. And it's a delicate balancing act. So
well,
I just have
too,
like the plates all spinning at one time in my head right now, that image.
Yeah, and this one too, like we were working with people, I mean, our data engineer was in Ukraine, you know, like Luda is in Ukraine, Brett's in Texas. I don't know where August is. Somewhere on the East Coast, you know, I don't know. And here's, you know, and actually, I don't know if it took us longer to do it this year, but we released it at a later date this year than even last year, when I thought it was going to actually happen faster, you know, and then we get into it and it's like, well, if you don't have people that can just be dedicated to it, and this was, I think, part of the problem early on, is that I was trying to manage a lot of the data pieces myself, but not giving it enough time. You know what I mean? So I'm like trying to manage Brett and then figure out what's going to go into the dashboard and connect with Luda to get the, you know, I'm trying to do all of that and get everybody together, but I'm like looking at it once a day, you know what I mean? And then, you know, Luda's in Ukraine and it, you know, 11, 12 hours ahead. And so, and then
everything that's going on in the world. So like, it's just a crazy
on top of all
situation.
that. Yeah. And so one of the things I tried to do is like, okay, once you get the data in the dashboard, then you have to move to the analysis. So you have to try and pull out these like interesting insights. Well, I handed the analysis off. I didn't do it myself. I tried to write it out like what we wanted, and I handed it off to a couple analysts, and then I didn't really interrogate it. I just kept like, how's it going? How's it going? You know, and then we get on a phone call because I just do a quick glance at the dashboard that they've built, and I'm like, oh, okay, it's filled out. So then we get on the phone. I'm like, okay, it must be ready to review. Then we get on the phone with our writer, and I start to like go through a couple of the tabs, and I didn't lose it, but I just got like frustrated. I'm like, this is not at all what I was hoping would be in here. These aren't really insights. They're mostly just kind of regurgitations of, like what the data says. And so then I was like, shit, we're several weeks behind right now. You know what I mean? Just because of this. And so then we had to really regroup. And that's where I had to ask Brett for another favor, and have him basically play the role that I would have done, which is go through and like pull out all the insights, and make them like truly, insightful. But that was a bear, and it did. We had several.
Hold
setbacks.
on. Let's not ignore the dad joke that was made about data while he's wearing a data hat. Like, let's just make sure that this is a social clip.
Yes, the data hat. Yeah, the guy that shouldn't be wearing the data hat. No, I should be wearing the data hat. That is my background. But man, I didn't have the time. This year, and it was right in the middle of our press conference that we also didn't really plan for, right? And so like, it was just, it was a rough one. But we pulled it together, and actually then we launched it, and it still wasn't right. So we launched it, and it's still fucking wrong. And so literally we've been working on it for the last couple of days, like. Great, let's fix this problem. So, fixing the plane while we're flying it.
So let's talk through timeline real quick. And I want to go back to the point that you just made, because I think there's a lot to unpack there. So I'm looking at a calendar right now. We launched it, I believe it was last Thursday, April 28th. And we started when? Did we start in February on this?
Probably,
if not earlier.
I think February. Yeah, because
was it February?
Yeah, that sounds right.
Okay, then that was probably the first problem. Probably should have started in November.
Totally,
honestly. Yeah. Yep.
So okay, just so people realize that even when we were kind of building it and flying it at the same time, like that amount of time wasn't even enough time. So just trying to put into perspective, when we do V3 next year, we're going to start even earlier than that. So back to the point that you made a few moments ago, Jason. So I think one of the struggles that we have with the report is how people can immediately jump to conclusions when they see the insights. And you look at, Jason's already smirking because I'm going to let him go on his soapbox here in a second. Jason was talking about averages, and you see, all right, well, if there's $42 million in ad spend being run through the platform and there's X number in closed won revenue, wait a second, that ratio is not right. So Jason, get on the soapbox.
Well, yeah, I mean, haters gon' hate, right? So.
Oh my God.
This is what we've been waiting for, folks.
Yeah, they're gonna hate. And so you get people chiming up out of the woodwork, trying to they're trying to call you out. They're trying to call you out with your data because they want to be the person that I don't know, gets a high five or something for it. I don't know what the reason is, but maybe they want to be smarter than we are. And so, so if you look at $42 million and $42 million to spend and $22 million of closed won, right? You're like, well, wait, what is that all about? And then you got to get into the details. Well, okay, how do you attribute revenue? No other platform does this. You know what I mean? Attributes, campaigns to opportunities and revenue. And so what does our attribution model look like? And, and we wanted to leave influenced out because we're influence is, influence, is it really? But, people like to see influence because maybe that's what a lot of people still report on today. So it's well, here, $25 billion of influence then. Is that what you want? Because here's what it's great.
Dr. Evil, yeah.
Yeah. And it was $25 billion of influence. You know what I mean? So I was if that's what you want, great. But, so you get people that are you telling me it for every opportunity, a metadata customer has to pay X dollars? No, Mr. Analyst, you obviously don't understand how averages work. Let's talk about how averages work. There's some that are $1, some that are $10,000, and it's all the spectrum in between that. But, only you are going to know if that's good enough for you or not, right? Because what you get today. And you could be in the same exact industry with the same number of employees, same amount of revenue, and I sell something that costs $5 a month, and Justin sells something that costs $5,000 a month in the same exact industry, and so it's hard, so that's the thing we want people to understand. And that's where some of the risk comes in, because you're like, well, if people just want to jump to conclusions and they don't really want to think about it, they can make some assumptions that maybe doesn't look that great, but if they don't want to spend the time to dig in, but we all felt that we'll get more benefit from releasing it and letting people comb through it and get their own insights than we would from the detractors and the haters that are going to, try and pull it down. So we'll see if we're right. Mm-hmm. Last year we were right. And so I figure like this year we will be as well. And then you also have to understand like, hey, people, this stuff is directional for you. I'm not telling you that like every B2B SaaS company in this industry gets a 5.3%, like click to lead, we're not saying that. So like come in curious with this kind of stuff. This isn't the end all be all, like this is the holy grail of B2B marketing, data. But it is data you can't really get anywhere else, because like no one else is tracking campaigns all the way down to opportunities and revenue with the kind of models that we have. And so there's so much richness in it. We took the risk.
And that was something that I think we learned as a somewhat hard lesson right before we were about to launch it, because we made sure that we shared it with our sales team, because we didn't want this to hurt our sales team in the conversations that they were having. So we got their feedback, and it was a super last minute ad, but we had to create a new section at the beginning of the report and the blog post that essentially was a bunch of different caveats that you need to keep in mind when looking at this, not to make excuses, but a perfect example is if we're playing up closed won revenue triggered by metadata campaigns, well, the only way that you can do that in the first place is if you're using our CRM integration with Salesforce. And we have plenty of customers who use metadata and pump a ton of money into it and don't use Salesforce or have it connected with Salesforce. So it's stuff like that that's going to skew the performance metrics that the lazy people who skip directly to the numbers and don't look at that then make a huge fuss over because they didn't look at the caveats in the first place.
Oh, it sounds like the internet.
Yeah, basically in a nutshell. Yes.
Sounds like
oh my god. Yeah.
Nice.
So Justin, now that we've gotten Jason off of his soapbox, although I kind of like that, if we're being honest,
me too, man.
Let's talk through some of the ideas that you have on how you're planning to use this, beast through the end of the year, because it is a luxury and one of the three big content pillars that we have.
Yeah, and this is where it's exciting, and this is why, like, in an ideal world, we would have gotten this out earlier, because you can leverage it throughout the whole year, and you absolutely should leverage it throughout the whole year. So we're still finalizing our plan, and there's nothing, scientific in that this thing's going to work one way and this thing's going to work another. But for us, and the way I'm kind of thinking about it, is I want something bigger to be able to drop at least every quarter off of it. And then I want something to be able to drop every month. And then I want to be able to drop something every week or day off of it. And that doesn't mean I'm writing a new blog post every day. What that means is we're going to be able to create content, whether it's a webinar off of this. So be on the lookout for that eventually. Whether it's an in-depth guide off of a section that's on it, whether it's a simple blog post, whether it's another podcast episode, whether it's a clip off of social. We have all of these images to be able to pull and share. It's really just taking the stuff you have. If you create this type of survey or really big content, you should absolutely be using it throughout the year. And I think that's one of the things we're going to absolutely do better this year is be able to drip that out. Because one of the things I see a lot is people do these, they share it once, you get a nice big spike, and then it flatlines for the rest of the year. And you're like, oh, we spent, if you think about all the time, effort, money, stress, work that we all put into this, we would be doing ourselves a disservice not to try and get the most out of it. We clearly want to do it because we think it's important. And so it's literally just for anybody else out there, it's having a plan for what are the next steps? How are we going to use this after the fact?
Yep. And I think that's, of the many things that you're good at, that's probably your biggest strength, and looking at, how much time is spent creating the content versus actually distributing it and then repurposing it. because up until you coming to Metadata, Jason and I were so focused on the next piece of content, the next piece of content. And then as soon as you publish something, the shelf life is basically like a day or a week, because then you're already worried about the next thing. And it was painful for us at first, because I think, and Jason, feel free to tell me if I'm full of shit here, but like, we had to kind of get you off of that a little bit at first, before you were more comfortable with kind of the distribution and the repurposing, because there were times when it was just you and I, and when Justin had started, we were trying to do way too much in a given month from a content perspective.
In a given week.
It was just this endless, in a given week, it was just this hamster wheel, and we never got off of it until Justin started to open our eyes with this.
Yeah, and I think also I mean, we've made a lot of progress, but I feel like we've got still a lot more we can do. You know, like we were just talking about this recently. These clips that we're building, like we're not even using them sometimes, you know? And so like literally I got to get better at, okay, Justin built me 3 clips off this podcast. Okay, day 1, you know, it goes live, boom. Day 3, you know, I take another clip, I write a little something about it, and then, if you want to go and listen to the whole episode, but it's got some, you know, meat, or just there's a perspective or a point or a learning moment in that post itself, you know? So it's not just like trying to drive it back to the podcast, but it's giving you a little bit something. Then, if you want to go to the podcast, here you go. So I see that, like the social sharing, getting it out there more. I think that's probably one of our next steps in terms of like getting the repurposing even going even more. And then I think like what we've also been talking about is we tried to get everyone on social in the company. And now we're kind of thinking like, okay, there's probably like 8 to 10 people, you know, that like really want it, that have a good following. And let's get them all doing it in a very consistent, you know, planned way. And so we'll probably start to, you guys are probably already figuring that out now.
Yep.
Yeah, and
we'll have to do another episode on that once we get moving on.
Totally. I think part of it too is like, when I think about utilizing a piece of content like this, it really is, how can I get this in front of my audience as frequently as possible without, you know, being annoying or whatever. But if you have valid insight, I mean, that's the thing. If you have valid insights out of a piece of content like this, like you're never going to be annoying. Like it's always going to be valuable information. And so I think whether it's a chart that you're going to pull out and show and focus on one set of data, and then again, it's valuable, like Jason was talking about, it's valuable in the feed, and then you just point back to it and say, hey, if you do want insights, like more insights, and be able to do your own, like, hey, we've got this research over here. And you can start to really see why doing something like that early in the year can really carry you throughout.
Yeah.
I love it. Well, I think we are probably right at time here. So this was awesome. We'll have to do this again for, the next big content release that we have, and see what we learned, from this last go around. So it's a little less rocky, but Jason, you might have to wear that data hat every time too. I like it. I
like to just be able to say like, let me put my data hat on. If I were to put my data hat on, how would I respond to this? I just need to have it on the side. Let me put my data hat on for a second.
There's a social clip. Sorry, Jason.
Use it.
Incredible. Yep. Yeah, that's a social clip. Well, thanks again for listening. Always awesome talking with you guys on content stuff. And I'm in our office right now, and our sales guys were not allowed to come in here and screw the recording up, so they're begging to come in.
Banging at the door.
That's our cue.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody.